So what I learned working with Andrew is if you're going to disagree with Andrew, you better have all the facts lined up and you need to be putting a strong case. So they got to 400. They'd made 400 of these. Then Andrew went back to the supplier of the forged hinges, who were French, and said, I'd like to place an order for some more hinges. And the French went, there are no hinges. We didn't make any money. Unless you want to order 10,000, we're not even going to entertain the idea. So we had 3 different handlebar types. You had 11 colours of bike. You could have a 2-colour bike. We had 3 different tyre options. We had a standard front wheel, a hub dynamo. We had battery lights. We had a super light front wheel. We had 3 different saddles, mud guards, rack, battery lights. So it came to something with the luggage. It was something like 1.3 million options. Because the idea was, well, you've got to do your 76 hours. You'll make it up some other time. And the timekeeping was terrible. So it just meant I come to work, every day I came to work, I didn't really know I couldn't rely on who was going to come in and what we were going to get done on any particular day. So I just sound like a grumpy git, don't I? I've got an issue with this. My name's Nigel. I worked at Brompton for 11 years, from the beginning of 2006 to the end of 2016. I came as a lean manufacturing manager. When I started, the company was 50 employees, making 13,000 bikes. By the time I finished, it was 240 of us, making 44,000 bikes. I'm here today because one of our design engineers was trying to organise to bring some brazers here to braze at the show. When I was at Brompton, we often tried it. We could never make the health and safety work. Oh, here he is. Hello, Colin. And I thought it was a great idea to come here and braze. And the organisers said, oh, could you bring someone along and give a talk? So Colin said to me, oh, Nigel, will you give a talk? And I'm like, yeah, sure. I like Bespoked. Anyway, there were no brazers. Was it the health and safety that killed it?
No,
or budget?
It was the budget.
The budget. Okay.
It's on hold for now.
Right.
Maybe another year.
So, this is why I'm here, to talk about scaling at Brompton. You are my guinea pigs. I've never done this before. I've written a talk. I have 38 slides. So now I'm anxious that it's actually going to be too long. But we'll see how we go. Okay, so we can have the first slide. I didn't want to assume that everybody knew what a Brompton was. So that's basically what makes us different is the average folding bike will have a hinge for the handlebars, one for the main frame. What makes a Brompton different is the back wheel tucks under. So you end up with a very small, compact package. My history with the company starts in 2006. I thought for a bit of context, we'd go back to the beginning, how the company came into being. This is Andrew Ritchie. So Andrew is the inventor of the bike and the founder of the company. Andrew went off and did an engineering degree in the late 60s. When he graduated, he had a couple of jobs, one working for an IT company and another one for an engineering company where he got some hands-on experience machining and welding. But he got bored with those and actually decided that what he'd really like to do is work for himself. So he actually started a little business selling household plants. So he bought a second-hand van from the GPO, and every morning he'd go off to New Covent Garden, buy some houseplants, load up the van, and then he'd spend the rest of the day knocking on doors in Hammersmith and Putney, selling his houseplants and doing a bit of landscape gardening. This went on for 4 or 5 years. At the same time, when he wasn't using the van, he'd use a bicycle to get around town. Like many of us, he'd get frustrated. He'd go to the pub and he'd forgotten his lock. or he'd be worried that actually it wasn't very secure, and he'd be worried if the bike would still be there when he came out. So he had this idea, wouldn't it be great if I could just collapse the bike and take it with me? But he never did anything about it. It was just this idea ticking around in his head. At the same time as this, there was a guy actually making a folding bike, a guy called Harry Bickerton. So this is a Bickerton, for anyone who's not sure. Harry was based in Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire, and he had a mate called Bill Ingham. So Bill was going around trying to find investors to invest in the Bickerton so they could get some better tooling, develop the product a bit more. And he was going around knocking on doors, and he had a meeting with Andrew's dad. So Andrew's dad worked in finance in the City of London. So this is why Bill pitched up. He did his pitch, and at the end of it, Andrew's father said, "Nice idea, but I don't think it'll ever come to anything. It's not for me. But my son is a very talented engineer, and I think he'd be a really good employee for your company. Perhaps you'd like to meet my son, see if you want to offer him a job." So the story goes that Andrew's dad summoned him, sat him down, gave him a good talking to, told him how he had this very good education and he was wasting it, and all the rest of it. It was about time he pulled himself together. So Andrew agreed to have a meet with Bill Ingham. Bill showed him the bike. Andrew took a look at it and thought, well, actually, I could do a lot better than that. And this is the thing with Andrew. He's a great thinker. He's a very smart engineer, and he likes things done his way. So what I learned working with Andrew is if you're going to disagree with Andrew, you better have all the facts lined up, and you need to be putting a strong case. And usually, the best I'd ever get out of Andrew was, it has some merits. I don't remember Andrew ever saying to me, "That's great," or "That's brilliant," or he'd always ask, "But what about this? And what about that?" I hadn't even thought about these things. You get so enthusiastic about how you've got this idea. So, having seen the Bickerton, he thought, right, well, I can do better. So he went out, he bought some tubes and some brazing equipment, and he made the first prototype in his bedroom of his flat. So this is 1975. He made prototype number 1 and prototype number 2, and then he needed a bit of money to be able to get some more materials and some parts. So he had a chat with his friends, and together they chipped in £1,000 to buy him some more materials. And in return, he formed a company and gave them all some shares. So the company was formed in 1976. So with this money, he then went on and produced prototype number 3, which is this one. That resulted in a patent. So the patent was granted in May 1977. And then we had prototype number 4. So the company still has prototypes 2, 3, and 4, which used to be on display until we got an archivist who came and archived everything we'd done over 40 years. And she said, "These are far too valuable to have you all with your grubby fingers on and mucking around with them." So they've all been locked up in a vault. Hopefully they'll come back one day and we can stick them on the wall. Prototype number 3 and then 4. Once he'd made his 4th prototype, he was happy with his design, and he decided that he didn't actually want to go into bicycle manufacture. He thought what he'd do is he'd approach a big bike company, get them to license the design, and then he and his fellow shareholders could sit back and the money would trickle in, and he'd go off and find something else to do. So the first company he approached was Raleigh, who at the time were making 1 million bikes a year in Nottingham. So he wrote to them, he sent them some photos, some drawings, followed up with some phone calls, had a meeting. Quite a few weeks went past, and eventually he got the rejection letter, which was, "Nice idea, but we don't think it has any commercial value, not for us." He approached Dawes, got the same answer. He even went to Black & Decker, who had recently launched the Workmate, a folding workbench, and the idea was that they were looking for more products, and they said no as well. So, having been able to find someone to license it, he then followed the same route as Bill Ingham, and he was around knocking on the doors of banks trying to get investors, and it all came to nothing. So this went on for a couple of years. Well, we think it's good. Went on for a couple of years. And he became quite obsessed by it. And every time he met his friends or family, all he'd be talking about was this folding bike. So eventually his friends said to him, Andrew, you're driving us nuts. How about we go out and we will pre-sell some bikes for you? It's like an early form of crowdfunding. How many bikes do we need to sell and at what price for you to be able to get the materials and some machines and get going? So Andrew said, well, if I could sell 30 bikes at £250, which is about £950 today, that will give me £7,500 and I'll probably be off and running. I will make the bikes in 12 months, and if the company ever makes a profit, I will give the £250 back. That was the deal. So his friends went out and they actually sold 50 bikes. So Andrew then went and borrowed some space from a friend's engineering workshop in Hammersmith, a guy called Nick Rusov. And it actually took him 20 months rather than 12 months because he's such a stickler for detail. And obviously he had his prototypes. When he came to manufacture, it wasn't quite the same. So anyway, this is bike number, oops, wrong way. That's Andrew with the finished bikes. And this is bike number 31. So this is one of those first 50. You can see it's got quite a unsophisticated bend in the middle. That was just bound to the meth he had to him. And the thing that took the most time was actually the hinges here and here. The hinge is actually got a cam in it, so they're all fabricated by hand. So when the frame closes up and you push the lever over, it's on a cam, so it holds it really tight. This is what took all the time. And you'll notice that the handlebars are always also braced to the handlebar stem. They came in one colour, red. They all had a rack. They went off, so the 50 bikes went off. They were well received, and he was up and running. So then he moved from Hammersmith to a workshop in Kew Gardens, just across the road from the Botanical Gardens. Took on his first employee, a guy called Patrick, and they started producing Mark I Bromptons. So they got to 400. They'd made 400 of these. Then Andrew went back to the supplier of the forged hinges, who were French, and said, I'd like to place an order for some more hinges. And the French went, there are no hinges. We didn't make any money unless you want to order 10,000. We're not even going to entertain the idea. So he got stuck. So the actual hinges look like this. So this is bike number 85. So it's a much simpler design, but much like today. So you've got the clamp on the end. So he'd actually taken orders for more than 400 bikes. So he actually spent 6 months machining hinges to finish all the orders off. So this was 1982. He stopped building bikes and he just worked for the engineering company and Kew Gardens instead. In the meantime, one of his first customers was a guy called Julian Verica. So Julian was an entrepreneur, a businessman who'd started Name Audio, high-end hi-fi company that was still in business today. One of Julian's passions was sailing. So at the weekend, he and his girlfriend were getting his little sailboat, sail up and down the English Channel across to France. Every time they got into a port, they'd unfold their Bromptons, cycle into town, have a meal, buy some nice cheese and wine, pedal back, fold the bikes up, get back in the boat. So Julian, we got to the end of 1985, Julian was looking to buy some more bikes. He managed to track Andrew down. I said, oh, the bikes are great, I'd like to buy a couple more for some friends. And Andrew explained that there weren't any bikes, there wasn't a company, because he couldn't get the hinges. So Julian said, well, what do you need? And Andrew said, look, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it properly. It's going to be £100,000. And with my friends and family and a grant from the GLC, so the London Council, I can get to about £60,000. I can't get the other 40,000. So apparently Julian said, not a problem, I'll go and get an overdraft at the bank. So Julian went off, got an overdraft and became our first sales and marketing director. So the idea then was that we would subcontract the manufacture of the frames to a company up in Walsall. The frames would then be painted before being shipped down to London, where the bikes would be assembled by Andrew and his colleagues. Then at the last minute, Andrew changed his mind. because he wasn't convinced that he would get the quality he wanted from the subcontractor, and that the only way to get the quality was if he was to make the frames himself in-house. So instead of going into production in 1986, 18 months went by whilst he designed, built, tested and remade all of the braze jigs needed to build a Brompton, which totals about, we have 17 separate braze operations. So it was finally the beginning of 1988 when the company started up and running, and we've been in continuous production ever since. So our first factory was a railway arch in Brentford. This is Sonny brazing some frames inside the arch, and this is Andrew assembling a bike. So that was 1988. Things went well. In 1991, we took over the second railway arch. 1993, we moved 3 miles to Chiswick. That's the bike they were making. That's a Mark II Brompton. They moved to Chiswick, to Bollow Lane. 17 employees, 2 of whom are still here. Mark and Ed still work for Brompton. So they both look a little older now, like we all do, but they're still there. Then in 1998, they moved again. They moved to Kew Bridge. So that was a 22,500 square foot factory. 28 people moved in, making 6,000 bikes. We'll go with that. Yes, 6,000. It was 3,600 here. And then by 1998, it was 28 employees making 6,000 bikes. So this is Kew Bridge, and the factory is the L shape with the white roof. Next to the elevated section of the M4, just by the Chiswick flyover, and in the corner is the new Brentford football stand. So the photo was taken after we'd left. We left in 2016. That's why it's got a bunch of cars outside and no bicycles. And I see the garden's gone. And anyway, so in 2002, a young engineer joined the company called Will Butler Adams. So I mention Will's name because Will has been the CEO for the last 16 and a bit years now. So Will's key to the story. And Will came along, having come from ICI, was used to a modern company with systems and procedures and everything being documented. Turned up at Brompton, and it was very, very different. The big issue they had was they just couldn't make enough bikes. So they were making, by the time I turned up in 2006, they were making 13,000 bikes, but the lead time would be 11 weeks in the winter and went out to 16 weeks in the summer. So if you placed an order for a bike in August, you'd be lucky to get it in time for Christmas. So they didn't actually have a manufacturing manager. Production was managed by 3 different people. So Will would look after the tooling and a bit of people. Greg used to order the paint and look after the building. And Mike used to do the purchasing. And then they had 3 supervisors. But it was all a bit haphazard. So they advertised for a manufacturing manager. I've always cycled, but I'd never heard of Brompton. But my background is I'd been working for 20 years at that point, just over 20 years. I'd worked for 4 different companies. The main one was DeSuter, making pneumatic tools. So I started there in 1985. 1993, we got bought by Atlas Copco. So DeSuter were 500, Atlas Copco were 25,000. They came in, they changed everything. They taught us modern manufacturing methods. What is known as lean manufacturing today, back then was called just in time. So this is where I learned all about lean manufacturing. I was responsible for some of the changes that we did. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and then the company sponsored me to do my master's. So I did my master's. Then I went to work for one of my old managers, and we made another transformation at the next company, changing from the old traditional ways of manufacturing to the new ways. So this is why Will recruited me. So I came along, had I think it was a 6-hour interview with Will, which was basically a chat. It was just a chat. Then I had to go and have an interview with Andrew and Mike, which was a bit different. With Andrew saying, but why? And Andrew asked me, what did I think? And I've been let down by the previous company, the interim one, who said they wanted all this change. And when I got there, they wanted change, but they didn't want me to upset anybody. So I thought, well, I'm not going to, I got very frustrated. So I thought, well, I'm not going through that again. So when Andrew said, you've been around the factory, what do you think? And I said, it's amazing. I said, it's rammed to the rafters with work in progress, with stock. There's stuff here that I've only seen in history books. I just told him exactly what I felt. He stopped the interview. They sent me out the room for 20 minutes. And apparently Andrew said to Will, he wasn't sure that I would fit, that I'd cause too much trouble. So anyway, it took 6 weeks for Will to persuade Andrew to give me a start. So this is what the factory looked like when I turned up. This is the stores on the left. The stores was absolutely rammed. And the philosophy at the time was, well, if we buy in bulk, we'll get a cheap unit price. So that's why they were buying in bulk. But they didn't take into account the cost of holding it, stock taking it, obsolescence, anything like that. And there was so much of it, we always struggled to find what we were looking for. At the same time, the slide on the other side, that's actually the assembly area. But it's the same. It's full of wheels. It's full of omni trolleys, which I'll come to in a minute, inspection trolleys. The only place that we built any bikes was along the back wall. We had 6 bike building bays. The rest of it was just storage. And the same here. So I started at the beginning of 2006, spent the first few months learning the ropes, meeting everybody, found it a really nice place to work. Everyone was very friendly, very passionate. But they were just stuck in their ways. So I would say to someone, this is interesting, why'd you do it like that? And 9 times out of 10 the answer was, well, we've always done it that way. And it seemed to me that they were doing it the same way as they'd done it since 1988. Nothing had really changed, it was just on a bigger scale. So there were a few things that I had a problem with. I had a problem with the whole fact, most 3/4 of the factory was just full of stock or work in progress. Piecework was my biggest issue. So piecework is where there's a rate for the job, an hourly rate, and the more you do, the more you get paid. So if you go faster, you earn more money. But the Brompton is a premium product. Our customers are paying a premium price for it. And the most important thing that's drummed into you from day one from Andrew is quality, quality, quality. And I couldn't square, quality comes first, but we're paying people for the faster they work, the more they get paid. And we'd had piecework at DeSuter's when I first started in the 80s. And Atlas Copco got rid of it. And the others, it became a multi-skilled workforce instead. So this was my first issue, was with the piecework. It also meant that with the piecework, people had their favorite jobs and other jobs that they didn't like doing. So they would try and pick and choose which jobs they did. So in brazing and engineering, where we were making the frames, they'd be arguing to try and get the best jobs. And then having started and got running, they didn't want to make any, they just wanted to carry on. So we had piles and piles of one part and nothing of the other. So here we've got batches and batches of forks in the stores. But then what we found was that when we came to build bikes, we'd have masses of one part and very little of something else. So I remember one day I had hundreds of front main frames and I couldn't find any front frames because someone thought they were making more money by making main frames. It was this sort of thing. In brazing, you've got the 17 different jobs that go up to make a Brompton frame. And the supervisor was called Abdul. Abdul was great. Abdul would issue a job and he'd say to Liam, right, I want you to make me 500 rear frames. So that's that rear triangle. So you've got a chain stay and a seat stay, just like a regular bike. And then you have what we call tension stays to make the triangle so that you can fold the bike under. So, and then you've got rear frame final. So there are 4 jobs to make a rear frame. So Liam would go off to the stores, route around, try and find a tension tube jig, take it back to his bay. So his bay belonged to him. So there'd be a big steel bench and there'd be all sorts of clutter and rubbish in it, like this. You can see here the tiny little space this guy Martin's got to braze in. Here was by the door with the cardboard up, because the other side of the door is where we used to keep the acetylene oxygen cylinders, and every time you open the door, the breeze came in. So, let's say Liam goes off, he finds the tension tube assembly jig, brings it back to his bay, then he's got to go and find his own raw materials, and each job, we stamp the brazer's initials, so we've got traceability, we know who brazed each joint. It means that the brazers don't take any shortcuts, because at any point we can pick a piece up and we know who made it if we're not happy with it. But the primary reason we did it was the bike goes out, is sold. Let's say 5 years later there was an issue and the bike came back. We can see who brazed the particular part. So there was an issue, there was a cross tube on the rear frame, and it sat up against both the chainstays. So when you braze it, it gets very hot and the air tries to expand. So someone had the bright idea of drilling a hole in it to act as an exhaust, which was fine until we started selling lots of bikes in Poland. And then through the long winter, with them putting salt on the road, salt used to get inside the cross tube and rot it from the inside out. So in my time, this is probably from 2006 to 10, I probably saw about 220 rear frames came back. These were rear frames that were made in the 90s, and someone had seen the problem and changed it. So we just used to give everybody, if someone had a corroded cross tube, we'd just give them a new frame, and we'd get the goodwill that way. So he'd stamp his own parts, then he'd have to find the wooden boxes that he was going to put the rear frames in. Then he'd check his oxygen in his acetylene cylinders, and if they were running low, he'd have to stop someone else working. They'd go and get the trolley, chain up the cylinder, take it outside, swap it over. Then he'd do some brazing. Because we didn't know how long the jig had been in the stores for, we didn't know if it was worn, if it was damaged. So then he'd have to take some samples and go off to inspection and get them checked. So it's just really, really inefficient. So I had a problem with that. Then on the assembly side, assembly was split into pre-assembly, final assembly, and inspection. So this is called an omni trolley. So the sales would release the orders down to the shop floor. Every bike is made to order. They'd be batched up into 11s. Then pre-assembly would pre-assemble the rear frame, the main frame, so they're joining the main frame to the front frame with the pin, putting the cups in, putting in the bottom bracket. They're putting the handlebars, so you've got all the different gearing options, and the tyres. So at the time, you could order any bike you wanted. So we had 3 different handlebar types. You had 11 colours of bike. You could have a 2-colour bike. We had 3 different tyre options. We had a standard front wheel, a hub dynamo. We had battery lights. We had a super light front wheel. We had 3 different saddles, mud guards, rack, battery lights. So it came to something with the luggage. It was something like 1.3 million options. Okay? And we took great pride in being able to buy any bike. And then we'd go to a bike show. And none of our customers knew, because if they went into a bike shop, they'd see a blue Brompton with 3 gears or a red one with 6 gears. Very few people actually knew that you could have all these choices. But it meant that every bike was built to order. And because the Omni Trolley held 11 bikes, we put 11 pre-assembled kits on it. And then you can see all these trolleys are stacked up, waiting for the bike builders to come along and take them. Now, because it was piecework, the pre-assembly guys have picked which Omni trolleys they want to load so they can earn the most money. Then the bike builders would come along and try and pick the Omni trolley that they thought had the easiest bikes to build so they could earn more money. They would take that trolley back to their bay. So the bay is on the right. This is Tota crammed in, putting the tyres on the wheels. You can just see how crammed it all was. Then in the bike bay, you'd have the Omni trolley on one side, and then the trolley on behind Richard on the right, that's the inspection trolley. So you'd go to your bay. We had to put all the parts we needed to build any bikes in the bay, so filling the bay up. We'd often have a stock out, so we'd be spending time going from bay to bay trying to redistribute the parts so everybody could keep building. And then as the bikes were built, they'd go on an inspection trolley. The inspectors would then come along, go to their favourite bike builders where they knew the bikes had been well built, take the trolleys back to their bay and inspect the bikes. If there was an issue, the bike went back to the bike builder to be fixed in their own time. And then we'd often have arguments because they'd be arguing about whether the gears were set properly or whether the brakes were correctly aligned, this sort of thing. So if it didn't get resolved, it just meant the bike would sit there because the bike builder wouldn't accept it was wrong and the inspector wasn't going to do it. So often, the inspectors would have a full set of tools, and to avoid any aggro, they would actually be correcting and fixing the bikes. So we didn't build the quality in, we inspected the quality in. And these trolleys took up all this space. It also meant that we started with 6 bike building bays, we got to 10 before we changed. And it meant that we couldn't afford to go out and buy some fancy electronic tooling, which we now have that records the torque on every critical fastener. Because these tools are £10,000, £12,000 a time. We're not going to buy 10 of those plus a spare one for a tool that's probably used cumulatively for 20 minutes a day. So we had basic torque wrenches, and the running joke always used to be that if you were a bike, you knew who the bike builders were because one shoulder muscle would, their neck was like that on one side, and this where they're talking all day long. There were a number of areas I thought were ripe for improvement. We also had flexi time. So that meant that you had to work 76 hours in any 2-week period. And the factory was open from 6 in the morning till 6 at night and 6 till 1 on a Saturday. So it was open for 67 hours a week. So you had plenty of opportunity to pick and choose when you worked. Plus, there weren't many holidays, and I couldn't find a sick pay system. People got paid sick pay, but on an individual basis, like down to circumstances. So what they were encouraged to do was if they wanted a day off, they just didn't come to work. Because the idea was, well, you've got to do your 76 hours. You'll make it up some other time. And the timekeeping was terrible. So it just meant I come to work, every day I came to work, I didn't really know I couldn't rely on who was going to come in and what we were going to get done on any particular day. So I just sound like a grumpy git, don't I? I've got an issue with this, and this. I saw them as opportunities. So this is the cluttered bike bay with the inspection trolley. These are my 3 supervisors. So this is Abdul, who looked after brazing, Torsten, who looked after engineering, and Tota, who looked after assembly. Okay, all of them really technically brilliant. Okay, really good at what they did. Every time you had a question about how to build a bike, you went and saw one of these 3. But the issue was they'd been promoted for their technical abilities. No one seemed to have taken into account their man management skills. Okay, so Abdul was pretty good. The other 2 weren't really interested, especially Torsten. You'd say anything to Torsten and he'd just sort of grunt at you. So I was thinking, right, I need to put these people in their best, find the best role for them. So at the end of the first year, I wrote everything up for Will and I said, these are the issues as I see them. This is, I think, is the way forward. And Will bought into it. So what I wanted to do was I was going to get rid of flexi time, and I wanted a 4-day week. So I'd introduced a 4-day week at 2 previous companies. So I'm a really strong advocate for a 4-day week. So it's the same number of hours, but condensed into 4 days rather than 5. I'd found that productivity goes up by 10% because people are better rested and relaxed. They've had 3 days off at the weekend. Absenteeism falls to a third because you don't get people phoning in with an upset stomach or a headache because they need to go to the bank or they want to go and see a new flat, or back in the day it used to be all the young guys were going off to get a new phone contract and couldn't wait. Because they do that on the 5th day. They do that on the Friday or whatever. And then no one ever leaves because every weekend's a bank holiday. So this coming week, next weekend, it'll be a 4-day weekend. So I was a strong believer in the 4-day week. I wanted that. I wanted to get rid of piecework and replace it with a multi-skilled pay system. So the more skills you had, the more money you'd earn. So because I wanted a flexible staff, I wanted to cover for holidays and sickness, and I wanted people taking an interest in everything we did and growing their skills because they're just better employees. What else did I want? Oh, I wanted to get rid of these brazers having their individual bays. I thought it made a lot more sense to have a bay set for a particular job with the jig permanently in it, So with our jigs, let's say it's rear frame final, we know that we can make probably 5,000 rear frame finals before the jig starts to wear because you're clamping metal on metal. So we have a preventative maintenance system now. When we get to 4,500 cycles, that jig comes out, goes into the tool room, gets refurbished, then you do the checks, adjust it if it's necessary, and then it's sitting on the side ready to go back in the bay and it's good to go. Also, I wanted to get the cylinders out of the bays. I thought this is nuts. This is a health and safety issue. We should be piping the gas in. Also, I wanted to combine engineering and brazing because we had these large batches. It made much more sense for me to have manufacturing cells. So I wanted a frame cell with main frame and front frame. I had a rear frame cell. I had a handlebar cell because we have a pin and a support. And we'd make these things as pairs because we consume them as a pair. So with the auto braze, where we braze the hinges, which is slightly different, we changed the tooling. So every time you'd brazed anything, you would braze a main frame and a front frame as a pair because we consumed them as a pair. In assembly, I wanted to get rid of this idea of omni trolleys, inspection trolleys, 3 separate departments. I wanted to put a line in. So the issue with the omni trolleys and people picking and choosing which bikes they built, let's say I had an order for Benelux, 180 bikes, 10 pallets of 18 bikes. And Simon would want particular bikes on particular pallets because they'd go into a warehouse and he needed to know what was on each pallet. So we'd issue the order on a Monday morning. The bikes would go out. People would pick and choose which ones they wanted to build, or some would go back. Thursday lunchtime, I'd probably have 160 bikes finished. I'd be missing 20 bikes. I'd have 10 part finished pallets filling up the space. And then I'd have to go and find the bikes. And either the Omni trolley had been pushed to one side, typically if it was a P-type with a hub dynamo, or you had bikes sitting on a rack that the inspector said was wrong and the bike builder said. And then I'd be spending Thursday afternoon cajoling people to get these bikes finished, whilst we've got all this space taken up with part finished orders. And it wasn't just Benelux, it would be Japan, it would be Germany, it would be South Korea. It was nuts. So I wanted a line where we would issue the bikes in the order that we wanted made. They'd come off the line, you'd fill up a pallet of 18 and it would go. And then the next one, and go. It was all about creating more production space. Getting rid of all this stock, getting rid of all this work in progress, getting rid of the trolleys, freeing up space. Because the only way we were going to grow to 50,000, which is the target that Will had given me, with a 2 to 3 week lead time, not this 11 to 16 weeks, I could see it was we needed a bit of order and we needed space for production. So I wrote this plan all up, handed it in to Will, went, exactly what we want, that's great. Then we had to go and see Andrew, because Andrew controlled everything. It was his business. He still owned 50% of the shares at the time. He'd been doing this for 30 years, since 1975. So at that point, he'd been doing it for 30 years. I had 20 years experience and Will had 10 years experience. So Andrew had as much experience building the bike as the total of Will and mine work experience. So Andrew's like, well, this is a bit drastic. I really don't think this is necessary, is it? And what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And we're like, blah, 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 blah. So we sort of started, but quietly and not trying to cause too much of a ruckus. And we sort of got stuck. We knew what we wanted to do, but we couldn't do it without Andrew's blessing because these were such fundamental changes. And then we got lucky. So the first thing that happened was there was a guy called John Putt. So John had worked for McKinsey, the management consultants, and he'd been the chief operating officer for Jordan Formula One cars for 3 years. So he had quite a good business background. He and his wife went to buy a couple of Bromptons, and he was horrified at the 16-week lead time. So anyway, eventually the bikes turned up, and he was dead chuffed with them. But he wrote a letter into Will saying, you make a wonderful product, we're very happy with the bikes, but oh my goodness, this lead time, you must be losing so many orders. I think I can help you with that. So Will brought the letter to me and said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, he's only telling us what you and I know. But John is 10 years older than me, and Andrew's 16 years older than me. So the advantage with John was John was much closer in age to Andrew and Andrew's friends who were non-execs on the board. So Will offered John a place as a non-exec. So he would be in the boardroom fighting our case along with Will. So John stayed 15 years and backed us to the hilt every single time. I mean, he was good. He would always challenge us, but we were all singing from the same page.